At that point, everyone started to laugh. In fact, it says laughter in the script here. Oh, I'm sorry. In the transcript. Keyword script. Hello and welcome to the very first podcast of Jurors in Disguise. My name is MaryRose Peterson, and I am the owner of Covert Ops Jury Investigations. What you may or may not know is that the term for jury selection is voir dire, or voir dire if you're from the South. Voir dire is a French term. It literally means to speak the truth. I find it ironic that I make my living looking for liars who failed to speak the truth during jury selection, or voir dire, even though that's what the very proceeding is called. I wanted to start out today with also giving you a little background into how juries began. Back in the day, I would have looked at the Encyclopedia Britannica that was on our shelf in our living room or gone to the local library. However, today, my grown children have encouraged me to utilize the wealth of knowledge provided by AI. So here we go. According to AI, when English colonists settled in North America, they brought with them a deep respect for English legal traditions, including the jury system. The first codification of jury trials in the American colonies occurred in Plymouth in 1623, where officials decreed that criminal and civil matters should be tried by a jury of 12 men. The first recorded jury trial in the colonies took place in 1630 in Plymouth, where John Billington was tried and found guilty of the willful murder of John Newcomen, whom he had shot and killed after an ongoing feud between the two men. The evidence against Billington was described as plain and notorious, and a jury wasted no time in finding him guilty. Following the conviction, Billington was sentenced to death, making him the first English settler in Plymouth colony to be executed for murder. Throughout the colonial period, juries played a crucial role not only in adjudicating disputes, but also in resisting unpopular British laws. Colonial juries often acquitted defendants charged under what were seen as unusual English statutes. We're not allowed to do that today, by the way. The law is what it is, and it's delivered by the judge. Juries don't get to alter it. The right to trial by jury became a rallying point in the growing conflict between the colonies and Britain. British attempts to curtail this right were cited as major grievances leading up to the American Revolution. When the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1788, it required jury trials for all crimes except impeachment. When the Bill of Rights was adopted in 1791, it further secured jury rights in the Sixth Amendment for criminal cases and in the Seventh Amendment for civil cases. Over time, the American jury system evolved. Initially, jury pools were limited by property, gender, and race, but reforms in the 20th century aimed to make jury service more accessible and random. Today, jury pools are chosen primarily from voter registration and DMV databases, both of which are government agencies, aka the state. The clerk of court in the courthouse is in charge of the jury pool. On the first phone call with potential clients, we talk about whether or not they got a fair trial. They don't understand, how did this happen? I'm innocent of these charges. How did I end up in prison? And I remind them, well, let's talk about this. So the jury pool was picked from government agencies, DMV, voter registration primarily. Then the clerk of court, who's the state, sends you an engraved invitation inviting you into the courthouse with the jury summons. Once you get there, you're welcomed, you're thanked. And then during jury selection, aka voir dire, the judge and the attorneys talk to you very respectfully. They tell you if you're embarrassed by any of the questions, which they're going to try not to ask those types of questions. But if they do, and if you're embarrassed and you don't want to talk in front of your new 50 or 100 or 500 potential jury friends, that you can come up and have a private conversation at the judge's bench. So they do their best to make you feel comfortable. And then if you're chosen, you are given a big juror badge. You're a rock star. You're elevated to rock star status. You walk around with the jury badge. You are escorted in and out of the courtroom while everyone stands out of respect for the jury. And the bailiff, who is armed, will stand outside the jury room and guard and protect you. If you ask, he will even escort you to and from your vehicle after court. After you serve and complete your jury service, the court will give you a certificate and encourage you to frame it and hang on your wall, and then we'll thank you for doing your civic duty. And you leave there feeling quite proud of yourself. How do I know that? I know because I got one of those engraved invitations one time. And when you think about it, how is anybody supposed to get a fair trial by an impartial jury when the entire proceeding is owned and run by the state? Well, I don't know that you can. But I received my jury summons, and it was the very first day of a new job for me. So I went wearing my suit. I was going to, in my mind, be excused from jury service as soon as I told the judge, I can't be here. I have a new job and they're waiting for me and I'm important. I was sure he would excuse me, but he was not impressed and I got chosen. So I sat there all week looking at these two young men at the defendant's table and thinking, if you're not guilty of this, what a horrible waste of time and resources. These law enforcement officers have spent 2 years preparing this case. All of these witnesses that have testified all week long said you're the one, said you're guilty, and you're not talking. Now, I don't know about you, but my gut says, if you're innocent, I want to hear it. I want to hear your side. And there have been jurors actually who've said that during voir dire. I'd have to hear both sides so that I know who's telling the truth and who isn't, because obviously somebody's lying. Those jurors are always excused. You're not allowed to have to do that. Why? Because you are innocent until proven guilty and you don't have to testify. So you're told as a defendant that you're innocent until proven guilty. The state has to prove their case and you don't have to testify. But I sat there all week and I was waiting for them to speak up and say something, and they never did. Well, on Friday, we went to the jury room. We were dismissed to deliberate. We ate our free lunch, and everyone literally got up to leave. And I said, "Where's everybody going? Are you bathroom break?" And they said, "No, we're going home." And I said, "What do you mean we're going home? We haven't discussed anything. We haven't voted." They were like, "All right, let's vote. Guilty, 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 guilty. We're done here." I said, "No, no, no. Wait, I don't know that. I mean, we've been here all week. Don't we owe it to these two young men to at least talk about it?" Well, they weren't happy, but I guess because I was insisting that everybody sit back down and that I had that stupid suit on, I got elected as a foreperson. I still remember we talked for about an hour. They said, "We're done." They got up and left. The bailiff came in and he said, "I need the verdict form." And I said, "Well, I guess that we voted guilty." I signed it. I left there. And we went back into court. We delivered the verdict. And I left there feeling so proud of myself that I had done my civic duty. And I felt bad for these two young men, but it certainly appeared, if everyone had told the truth as I thought they would have, because who's going to come in here and lie, that they must be guilty. So I felt like I did the right thing. So I left there that day feeling very proud of myself. I had performed my civic duty. I was a champion of justice. And then I met Martin Peterson. When I met Martin, he was driving over the road. He had a beautiful flatbed. It was a 50th anniversary Rettenauer, I believe is how it's pronounced. In fact, we'll put pictures up so you can see what it looked like. The truck, the semi-truck, was called Old School. It was actually famous in Florida, and you may, if you Google it, you probably see that many people have owned Old School. He was very proud of that truck, and rightly so. We used to talk every day for hours while he drove over the road, going all over. He drove all over the United States, delivering everything from steel coils to Sherman tanks. I just found him fascinating. I had never met anybody like this. I'd never met anybody that was a truck driver, a professional driver. And I found his stories fascinating. I had barely ever traveled out of the state of Florida. So hearing him describe all the beautiful sunsets and the sunrises and all the terrain, it just gave me an even better and greater appreciation for God's country. And all I could think about was, I want to ride shotgun. I want to be there next to him. My husband had died suddenly several years before, and I'll admit I was lonely. Martin, I knew, had been divorced, and seemed like he was lonely too, and it just seemed like, as they say, a match made in heaven. So we were dating a few months, and he could tell I was serious. Let's face it, I was serious from day one, but he was getting serious. So he said, "I need to tell you something very important." And we had just finished supper at his house, so we sat down on the couch, and he began to tell me a story that shocked and horrified and left me heartbroken. In fact, halfway through the story, I got up and I had to go cry. He found me crying in the bathroom and came in and said, "It's gonna be okay." And I said, "I don't know. This is pretty dramatic." He had told me that his stepdaughter had falsely accused him of sexual abuse, and his ex-wife, well, then wife, went along with it because he had just told her that he wanted a divorce. I'm not gonna get into all the details, that's not important, and I'm not here to embarrass or shame anyone, especially not Martin. But he had hired an attorney, and the attorney said, "Don't worry about it, go back to work. It's never gonna go to trial." Well, it did. Two of the things actually that he said to me really stuck. He said that his then wife refused to take their daughter to get a medical exam. So the Child Protective Services had to order her to do that. I thought that was odd because if you thought that your daughter had been abused, why wouldn't you want that to be proven? And the other thing was that she wouldn't file for divorce. So several months after the accusations, Martin filed for divorce. I thought that was odd too. There just were little red flags all along the way that told me that there's more to this story than what I could read on paper. Well, fast forward 4 months, I dropped Martin off at his attorney's office. He was going there for trial prep because they had not dropped the charges. I actually went across the street to a Publix, and I got a buggy, and I started to shop. I didn't have anything in the buggy yet when Martin called me on the cell phone, and he said, "The state has offered me a plea deal." And I remember I just stopped in the middle of the aisle, and I said, I don't know what to do with that information. I don't know what that means." He said, "Well, they're telling me if I won't go to trial, that I'll just have to agree to 12 years of probation." And I said, "Again, I don't know what that means. This is all new to me." And he said, "What should I do?" I froze. I said, "You're asking me?" I mean, I had known him for 8 months, but I'd only known him for 8 months, and I didn't know what to say. I said, "Well, I don't know." I said, "I guess we're gonna have to talk about this. Do you have to decide right now?" He said, "Well, that's what they're telling me." I said, "Well, I love you, but I can't make that decision for you." He said, "Well, come back and pick me up." So I did. We talked about it that night. We talked about it all the next day. He called his attorney on a Monday night and said, "No deal." Well, she wasn't happy about that, but he had arrived at it because after looking at all the paperwork, I just looked at him and I said, "Well, how many jurors are we gonna have?" He said, 12. I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Yes, my attorney's been telling me for over a year, guaranteed 12 jurors. It's a capital case." I said, "Okay, all right." I said, "Well, what are the odds that 12 people are gonna come in here, listen to all these lies, and vote guilty unanimously?" And he's like, "Well, that's true." And I said, I think that we should not take the deal. I think we should go to trial and let your story be heard." I didn't know then that he wasn't going to testify. And that's another thing too. I've had a lot of people say they wish they'd testified, and I just tell them, "Look, here's how I see it, because here's how attorneys have framed it. If you testify on your own behalf, and let's say, for example, you become emotional and you start to tear up, your voice starts to quiver, you start shaking, it could very well be perceived that you're feeling guilty, you're feeling remorseful for what you supposedly did. On the other hand, if you also become emotional, but instead of looking weak, you try to look strong, you become angry, you maybe outburst, you start screaming, 'I'm innocent, I didn't do this.' The judge is going, 'Order in the court, order in the court.' What a spectacle." Well, then you look like a violent person. You must have done what they accused you of because look at you. You can't hold it together. So you can't really win, in my opinion, if you testify. So the next day we showed up for jury selection, and the jury pool came walking in, sat in the jury box. And, in the courtroom, if you've ever looked at a courtroom, if not, you could Google it and look at some images. The jury is almost always seated off to the side. In fact, a lot of times they're in a box where you really can't even see them very well at all. And you focus your attention on the witness stand in front of you. You're not looking over here. You're paying great attention to all the witnesses and what they are saying. So I've actually had potential clients call me the evening after they were convicted and went back to the jail. Someone would tell them about us, and they would call us and say, "What can you do? What can you do to help me?" And one of my first questions is, "Okay, so you were convicted today. It's okay. We got this. Were there 6 or 12 jurors?" I have yet to have anyone who can tell me. They are in such shock and so traumatized by being innocent and wrongly convicted that they can't even remember how many jurors there were. And some of these trials last weeks, and they still can't remember where there are 6 or 12. I think that is orchestrated by the system so that you don't pay attention to the jury. They don't want you looking at the jury. They don't want you thinking about the jury. They don't want you to challenge the jury verdict, which is what we do. But back to the jury, there was one point during jury selection, the voir dire, when Martin's attorney actually said, I'm going to read it from the transcript. She said, "Does anybody think that he, Martin, should testify?" Juror number 53 said, "I think he should make up his own mind." Well, as soon as she said that, she kind of sat up in her seat, and I looked over, and everyone looked at her and said, "Wow, okay, this is good." She said, "I don't think he should, and I don't think we should have a feeling on whether or not he testifies. He's already being attacked, whether he's guilty or not. He's already under scrutiny and attack. And if he chose not to put himself in the limelight of that attack," and I remember she kept saying attack, "whether he's guilty or not, who's to question that, The burden of proof is not on the defendant. I'm sorry. It's complete opposite. So he doesn't need to if he doesn't want to." As soon as those words were out of her mouth, I thought to myself, "Oh, we want her on the jury. She likes us. She's pro-defendant. She doesn't seem to like the state very much." Well, later, Martin's attorney also said this, which I thought was really interesting. If you've never sat through trial, you should go sit through trial. They're open to the public. You would find it quite entertaining, and I don't say that in a good way. But Martin's attorney actually said to the prospective jurors, "Do you understand that the state, and we'll kind of talk this out, but the state has the entire burden of proof to find guilty. So literally, I could sit down at that desk and I could read a book," and that at that point everyone started to laugh. In fact, it says laughter in the script here. Oh, I'm sorry. In the transcript. Keyword script. "I could sit there and I could read a book and do nothing, and would that be okay? I could not open my mouth once. Would you be okay with that?" Well, one prospective juror just said no. Well, he was struck. Okay, so jury selection is over, and the prospective jurors leave the courtroom. We're sitting there, just a few of us, to decide who we want on the jury, who's going to be struck, who's going to be kept, who will be chosen. After we got to 6 and an alternate, the judge said, "Okay, we're done here," and he's doing this. And Martin's attorney raised her hand and said, "Can I ask a question?" The judge said, "Yes." She said, "Am I missing something, or are we supposed to have 12 jurors because it's a capital case?" And the judge said, "No, not on this." My heart sank. I had I had talked my, I hoped, future husband into turning down this probation because I said there were guaranteed 12. Now we find out, no, there's only going to be 6. I was in a jury with 6. I know how easy it was. Like I said, they wanted to vote and go home. They didn't even want to talk about it. And those memories came flooding back, and I just sat there stunned. I said, I don't think we can win this now. At that point, Martin and I, it was very quiet driving home. We started to think that maybe we'd done the wrong thing by turning down this plea offer from the state. The next day at trial, I sat there listening to lie after lie after lie. Martin's daughter, and again, I'm not going to go into a lot of details. I don't want to embarrass anyone, but she said she was forced to have sex because it was punishment for not doing her chores. Now, that made no sense to me at all. If that were true, you would have permanent lifetime blackmail over Martin Peterson. All you'd have to say is, if you make me do my chores, I'll tell. So how did we get to this point? At one point during the trial, Martin's accuser, stepdaughter who he'd adopted, was asked, by his attorney, do you recall telling the state attorney that you had sex pretty much every day, but today you said it was once or twice? His accuser said, I said sex more than once, more than 2 times. That's pretty much every day. That's more than twice, is almost every day. It's pretty much the same thing. What? That's not the same thing. Not at all. In fact, when those words came out of her mouth, I had to resist the urge to start laughing. It was dead silence in the courtroom, and I thought, well, that I'd probably be held in contempt and maybe arrested for laughing. But I thought, well, okay, well, if that's the case, then we're done here. I started planning in my head, where are we going to go to celebrate dinner tonight? Where are we going to go to celebrate that this nightmare is finally over? We're done here. After about 4 hours of testimony, the jury was released to deliberate. We literally walked out into the court area, and within minutes, we were told the jury's back. We came back in, and as soon as those jurors came walking in and turned around, I knew we'd lost. The woman who had given that big speech had become the foreperson. When the clerk read the verdict, guilty on all counts, I was stunned. I still am. I was sitting behind Martin. He was in front of me at the defense table, and I saw him lean forward and grab the table. I thought he was going to faint, but he didn't. How could this happen? I sat down. Everyone started to leave, and they take Martin, and I watched him being fingerprinted and put in handcuffs. It was at that moment I thought, we made a horrible mistake. This is just awful. I knew life, no chance of parole. Based on what? No DNA, no eyewitness, no corroboration, nothing. They couldn't even prove that anything ever happened. So how did this happen? Well, 13 years later, it's still very raw. In fact, when I left there that day, I turned to a family friend and I said, I'm going to have to follow you because I don't remember how to get home. He thought I was kidding. I said, I'm not kidding. So I followed him home. Martin called me that night, and the first words out of his mouth were, what have we done? And I said, I don't know. I don't know. But one thing I did know was that wasn't the end of the story. I think what I did next is going to surprise you. So I hope that you'll tune into the next episode because I'm going to pick up the story there and continue on. If you or someone you know has been falsely accused and you're on your way to trial or you've already been convicted, reach out for help. You can find my contact information in the description below. And remember, The courtroom may be silent, but we won't be. So speak up, speak out, and always speak the truth.